Hello, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here joining us today, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So for those of you who don't yet know Salzburg Global Seminar, Designs on the Future is a new initiative, partly inspired by COVID, to tackle tough issues and focus on the opportunities that do lie ahead. It's directly inspired by Salzburg Global's radical roots. Today's theme, should history carry a health warning, is brutally topical at this moment of converging crises and a serial loss of trust in leadership worldwide and across many sectors. But this goes to the very heart of Salzburg Global Seminar's founding vision. We were founded out of conflict by three young people in 1947. They were watching history made in front of their eyes at Harvard University as leaders were forging the Marshall Plan for Europe's economies. Their own vision was a Marshall Plan of the mind, and they had a deep sense of the moment, writing the history of the future, taking agency. Our first chair back in 1947 was F.O. Mattison, who embodied that sense of history. He was understanding the human yearning for a new order and how to release the potential in society. And he gave a statement in 1947 that still informs every aspect of our work. He said, "We have come to Salzburg to enact anew the chief function of culture and humanitarianism, to communicate with one another again in ways that cut through prejudice and destroy the barriers of ignorance and hate." Our historic home here in Salzburg has its own contested history. It was home from 1918, from the end of the First World War, to Max Reinhardt, the founder of the Salzburg Festival, who had the vision of a festival of peace, those moments of never again in 1918, when humanity as a whole vowed that never again would there be a world conflict. And that creative utopia, the Salzburg Festival, and so much else during the 20s and 30s, was smashed by another global conflict. The Schloss itself, our historic home, has witnessed cycles of power, persecution, and renewal. The Nazis were in occupation during the war, immediately before we as an institution were founded. Now, 75 years on, we have stood the test of time and have seen the post-war period, the Cold War, the arrival of globalization, and now the converging crises of which I spoke. And we have 38,000 fellows in 175 countries sharing in that mission to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. Trust and openness have been very important to the work that we, with partners around the world, have led. One flagship program, for example, for conflict transformation, focuses on Holocaust education and genocide prevention, working with people across Africa, Asia, and around the world on new strategies for peace innovation. So to today's topic, should history carry a health warning? The 21st century is not even a quarter of its way through, but already we're seeing so many parallels with events 100 or more years back. And those are inviting easy comparisons with historical cycles of the past. We are seeing, for example, the rise of extremism, of ethno-nationalism, of polarization, of increasing economic precarity. We're seeing anti-intellectualism, the contesting of science, the contesting of information, the questioning of truth. And we are, of course, in a huge global pandemic, which recalls only too vividly the 1918 Spanish flu. More insidiously or less tangibly, culture wars are on the rise. Too many find an identity in nostalgia or in attack. And we see history being instrumentalized for partisan agendas and for myth-making. Today's conversation is part, as I mentioned, of the Designs on the Future series launched this year. And we've already had some extraordinary speakers focusing on questions from the future of democracy to racial equity, to the whole question of will we still invest in ideas? But today's conversation is also part of our distinguished Palliser Lecture series, and that's a very important milestone for Salzburg Global Seminar. The lecture series was established in honor of Sir Michael Palliser, who served as vice chair of our board for many, many years. And Sir Michael had outstanding dedication to public service, to international cooperation, to diplomacy, particularly in Europe, and also to culture. We inaugurated the Palace Lecture back in 2014, and we have already had many distinguished past speakers join us for those debates. We've been helped by our wonderful partner, the 21st Century Trust, and by the Aga Khan Foundation, who, absent COVID, would be hosting us in London in their extraordinary building there. Now, before we turn to Margaret Macmillan, a quick word about the format. This is very conversational. It's intimate. I know we're separated by cyberspace, but forging community has never been more important. So Margaret's lecture will be in 3 chunks. After the first and the second part, I will get to jump in with 1 or 2 questions. And during that time, we're inviting you to submit your provocations and your questions in the chat box. My great colleagues are going to do a little filtering exercise. And then if you're asked to submit a question, you'll then get a message asking you to pose it live to Margaret at the end, activating your video to do so. So with all that, I'm now absolutely delighted to introduce Margaret Macmillan, our Palliser Lecturer for 2020. You'll find her full bio in the chat box and on our website. But as so many of you know, Margaret is a globally renowned historian, author, educational leader, a trustee of the Central European University and the Imperial War Museum. She's a fellow of Salzburg Global Seminar, and we had the pleasure to meet her in 2014 when we did a program looking at history called 1814, 1914, 2014, Lessons from the Past, Visions for the Future. So I can't really think of anybody better than Margaret to help us understand better in these traumatic times what we can learn from history, what are the limitations of such learning, and how we can make that learning useful in better tackling the common challenges. Margaret, we are so pleased to welcome you virtually, and the floor is yours, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Of course, I think like a lot of us, I'd rather be in Salzburg, in your beautiful city. At the moment, I'm sitting in Toronto and I'm looking out on a very snowy scene. I don't know if you have snow in Salzburg yet, but here it's been snowing. I'm very pleased to be able to give this lecture, and I'm very grateful to the Salzburg Global Seminar and the 21st Century Trust and the Aga Khan Foundation. Your slides, I think, showed very well why we are so interested, as did your words, why we are so interested in history at the moment. Because we do have a sense that we're living through an historic moment, a moment of transition, a moment of great challenge or great challenges. And I think we do look to the past to try and find some sort of helpful advice, some sort of way of understanding our present situation. We have to, of course, be careful how we do it, which is one of the reasons my lecture is called, Should History Carry a Health Warning? And my answer, very briefly, is going to be what is probably a typical historian's answer, and that is yes and no. We all know, I think, about the dangers in the misuse of history. As Claire mentioned, the instrumentalization of history, the ways in which populist leaders will use history to create narratives, and their supporters will create narratives of a particular past, which will justify certain actions in the present, or the ways in which history can be used to summon up hatred and fear of others by presenting, again, a false narrative against them. History can also be misused when people use it simply to justify what they want to do. And of course, there is so much history, you can always find justification for whatever you want to do somewhere in the past, even if the examples aren't necessarily good ones. But having said that, and I think we're all aware of the dangers of bad history, and we've seen what it can mean in places like the Balkans, I think I want to say that history is important. It's one of the tools in which we can understand the present. History can bring understanding of our current situation. It can bring understanding of the challenges we're facing, and it can help us in some ways to anticipate the future. It can help us to formulate questions being able to ask the right questions is very important. If we flounder around, we don't even know where to begin to look for solutions, then we're in trouble. And that's where history can help. By looking at the past, by looking at past crises, for example, we can say, what did they do then? What might we do now? What should we try and avoid? History gives warnings. It gives warnings against mistaken assumptions. Too often, and I'll just say something about this in some detail, too often in the past, peoples have made assumptions about what is happening. They have ruled out other possibilities. They've narrowed their perception. And that, I think, can be very dangerous indeed. We can look at the past to find parallel situations to the ones we're in. And the situations will only be parallel. They'll never be the same. History does not repeat itself. But when we look for parallels, for previous examples of the challenges that we are facing, we can perhaps begin to understand what went wrong in the past, what mistakes were made, but also what went right. Why did some societies deal with crises better than others? What were the reasons for that success? And at the moment, of course, what we're thinking about is catastrophes, because we are ourselves in what is a major crisis. And so what we have been doing, and I think it's been a helpful exercise, is we've been looking at the past and looking at other sorts of pandemics. There's been a lot of attention paid now to the great influenza pandemic of the period just at the end of the First World War, but we're also looking further back. There are new and interesting books on the Black Death, on the plague that hit Europe in 4 successive cycles from the 6th century right up until the 19th century. And so we're looking back at previous catastrophes, such as pandemics, but we're also looking at other sorts of catastrophes. We're looking at economic catastrophes, great crashes, because part of what we're facing at the moment is an economic challenge, both domestically and internationally. We're looking at climate challenges. We're looking back, many of us, to the 17th century, to the mini ice age, which had such a pronounced effect on the world as a whole. And we're asking why some societies were unable to deal with the challenges of that mini ice age, which led, of course, to crop failures, floods, unexpectedly cold weather, famine. Why did some societies weather that particular storm and others didn't? We're also looking at civil unrest. Why did some societies, or why have some societies broken down? Why have tensions got to the point where citizens rise up for various reasons and regimes collapse? And of course, we've also been looking at war, which is a subject that I'm particularly interested in. Major wars, why do they happen? Is there something we can learn from how they happened? And is there something we can learn from how different societies dealt with them, both at the time and in the aftermath? And I think what we also have to be aware of as we look at history and think about our present situation is that often crises don't come singly. They overlap, they reinforce each other. And so the pandemic hit us at a time when there were already tensions and problems arising from globalization or certain parts of globalization. The pandemic hit us at a time when we were already concerned about growing inequality in our societies, already concerned about the weakening of international institutions and norms. And this is something we also need to take into account. We can't just deal with one crisis at a time. Often they come severally and they overlap with each other. And we do sometimes see in history tipping points, points when the cumulative effect of crises is so great that they begin to fundamentally alter the nature of society and change the trajectory of history. The 17th century global crisis, I think, is such a crisis. It was compounded, of course, of climate change, famine, civil unrest, but it was also exacerbated by war, by internal strains, by competition. Wars were going on around the world. And that helped to make a very different world coming out of it. We look at what happened in France at the end of the 1780s. In 1788, France had something called the Great Hunger. There was famine across France, crop failures as a result of climate changes, but also there were problems with the distribution of goods in French societies. And the French state was virtually bankrupt because of the wars in which it had been fighting. And that series of overlapping crises, plus a growing lack of faith on the part of many in the elite themselves and ordinary people in the institutions of the monarchy, in the institutions of the church, in the institutions that had held France together for so long, that series of overlapping crises led to the French Revolution. It didn't come out of one cause, it came out of a series of different causes. And again, when we look at the past, we can see this happening. It's always much easier to see it in retrospect, but I think we need to always keep our wits about us and look around us and make sure that we are looking for danger signals at our own time. This doesn't, I'm not advocating enormous pessimism and thinking that everything is dreadful, but I think we need to be aware of what might go wrong. You know, there were warning signals before this current pandemic, just as there were warning signals before the French or Russian revolutions. There were warning signals before the First World War, just as there were warning signals before this particular pandemic. The world had seen earlier pandemics in the last decades, SARS, MERS, and it had seen Asian countries actually dealing quite successfully, and Middle Eastern countries dealing quite successfully those pandemics, or Ebola in Africa, and African countries and the international order had dealt quite successfully with the Ebola crisis. But I think people living in Western countries had tended to think those are things that happen elsewhere. And if they worried about pandemics, they worried about the influenza epidemic, which had so marked Western societies at the end of the First World War. And so in a sense, they were looking in the wrong direction. And so I think we need to, by looking at the past, alert ourselves to things about where we may go wrong in the present. And this is, again, not to say that history is going to produce any very clear lessons, but what it will do, I think, is act as a salutary warning. And I think we also need to be aware of the human tendency to explain away warning signals. To say, for example, when people did warn quite correctly of a pandemic, oh, we'll find a vaccine. You know, we have lived in a world in which science and technology have produced an extraordinary range of benefits for our health. Most of the diseases, childhood diseases I remember as a child, have pretty much vanished, except in certain parts of the world or among certain segments of society. And polio is no longer the scourge that it was when I was a child. And if you go further back, smallpox, typhoid, cholera, these were all things that people in developed societies had to worry about in the 20th century. And those have virtually disappeared. But the dangerous side of that is we've got used to thinking there's always a cure for everything. And we know that we have misused antibiotics with the result that super bugs are now being produced. And I think we need to be careful about not taking warning signals seriously. And a classic example, I think, is in the First World War. Before the First World War, it was becoming more and more obvious that improvements in technology, improvements in organization, improvements in railways, which made supplies much easier, were making it possible for wars to last for a very long time and making it possible for the defense to be much stronger than the offense if both sides were equally balanced. And there were signs that this was happening. There were wars where this happened. The American Civil War, the Russo-Japanese War, wars in the Balkans just before the First World War. And too often the military planners simply explained these away. They said, oh, well, those wars happen in other places. They happened among peoples who weren't as civilized and as progressive and as good at military things as we are. And so I think we have to guard ourselves, if we can learn from the past, against explaining away things that we don't want to believe in and explaining away things that are inconvenient. Well, Claire, I think I've talked long enough, and you may have a couple of questions here before I go on to my next section.
Well, I'm gathering my breath mentally because that was already so rich, and you raised a lot of things there. One, obviously, you know, we're all deeply human. You know, with the benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing. A couple of things that came to my mind. You know, you show how humans in general and political actors in particular aren't very good at recognizing these inflection points and discerning the consequences. We tend to be selecting the evidence and constructing the plausible narratives to bolster our sense that we've chosen wisely. I'd like to unpack that a little bit more, because you focused on a couple of things. For example, this tension between introspection to the immediate short-term or localized priorities compared with what we know to be global drivers, global trends, global risks, and of course, global opportunities. Could you talk a little bit of that through the lens of what you're watching now, particularly as you observe political actors, whether you see that learning and, dare I say, any dawnings of humility? Question mark.
Well, I think the dawnings of humility, perhaps, but not perhaps as quickly as one would hope so. I mean, it's a fascinating subject. I think that what we're seeing is people having to adjust their assumptions. And as we know, psychologists talk about a confirmation bias. You know, we tend to have a certain set of assumptions, and the evidence we get, we tend to feed in, or we tend to explain away the inconvenient evidence. And it takes something to shake us out of that for the most part. And I think what COVID-19 and its effects on society and the global order is doing is shaking us out of some of our assumptions. We tend so often to assume that the future is just going to be more of the past, that we can, we can just assume that it's going to go along. And in some ways, I think, trying to predict the future. I mean, I will get in a sort of, not criticism, but suggestion that social sciences don't always get it right, because they tend to extrapolate from the trends they see in the past and to assume that they will go on into the future. And I think what historians perhaps realize is, yes, indeed, trends do matter, and you can often predict where those trends are going to go, but that you have to be ready for contingency and accident. And you have to be ready for the unexpected. Someone will invent something, something will happen, and a volcano will explode that will suddenly have an effect on the world. And so I think historians perhaps are a little bit more nimble in dealing with the future, because we don't always expect it to be the same. We understand that you can get contingency and you can get accident, which doesn't mean we shouldn't try and gauge what the future will be. I think we have to do that, but we should not put too much faith in trends going in a particular direction. We may need to accept that those trends may in fact reverse or move in different directions.
Can I follow up with one other brief question? I was really struck how you were talking back to the 17th century about the mini ice age. You made a seamless and elegant connection between issues around climate, planetary boundaries and so on, and the societal and economic pressures. Are you yourself and those in your community of historians getting better at talking to scientists? Is there more crosswalking between those disciplines that you observe? Or is that something that you would see as waiting for us in a brave new world?
I think historians, if I may say something for my own profession, have always been quite good at working with other disciplines. I mean, we are sort of intellectually eclectic. And we're interested in demography, we're interested in economics, we're interested in history of ideas, we're interested in political philosophy. And I think increasingly you're seeing historians going into such areas as material history, for example, trying to work out patterns of consumption, trying to work out patterns of production. And increasingly historians, and I think it reflects very much present concerns, are interested in environmental history more and more. They are looking at what factors have affected human societies through the past. And of course, those are often environmental factors. And one of the books that I've been looking at recently is by Geoffrey Parker on the 17th century. And he takes environment very seriously indeed. I mean, he sees it as something which we perhaps have neglected in looking at the past, and we need to. So yes, I think there is a dialogue, and I hope there will be more and more between historians and people in other disciplines.
Brilliant. So that leads us right into your second chunk, which is really looking at, can historical understanding of past crises, creative leadership and interconnections better guide responses to today's systemic converging risks? So back to you, Margaret.
Okay, well, my answer again will be, of course, yes and no, because when we look at the past, we can see actually the range of responses that we've seen recently in the crises we've faced, whether it's the 2008 economic crisis or whether it's the current pandemic crisis. Responses range from sheer panic, not knowing what to do, looking for others to blame, trying to escape, to trying to pull ourselves together, trying to deal with it, taking new measures. And this is actually, I think, very typical of human beings. Let me just talk a little bit, if I may, about the Black Death, because I think it is a very interesting example. It was the second of the great waves of the plague, the bubonic plague, to hit Europe. And it came in the middle of the 14th century. And the reactions ranged again from denial, some people saying that it wasn't going to happen, or blaming people. If you got the plague, it meant that you were sinful and it was God's punishment on you. To, of course, apocalyptic fears that it meant the end of days, that the world was coming to an end. Some societies collapsed virtually. In some cases, those who were rich enough, who had country estates outside cities, fled to those country estates. They weren't actually that much safer there because, as we now know, the rats that carry the lice, that carry the plague, were everywhere. In other societies, you've got people who tried to appease a vengeful God. You've got bands of wandering flagellants who beat themselves and went around Europe trying to atone for the sins of humanity. But you also got societies taking actually the most practical measures they could at the times. Of course, they didn't know how the plague was carried, and they didn't know how to cure it. I mean, the horrific thing about the plague was that it attacked the young and often the healthy, and it killed them very, very quickly indeed. But they took what measures they could, and those measures are ones that we're still using today. Governments, city governments often, and often cities did best because they were cohesive and they were socially cohesive, and people tended to know each other. And they had a certain degree of self-government, usually only by elites. But cities declared states of emergency. They set up cordons sanitaires around so that people could not come in who might be bearing the plague. And cruelly, they also pushed out those who they suspected of having the plague to starve outside the city walls. It was cruel, but you can understand their reasoning. They set up quarantines. Venice, for example, had quarantine on an island for ships arriving from the east, because the Venetians suspected, I think with good reason, that the plague was being seaborne in from the east. They paid for and equipped plague doctors. If you go to Venice during Carnival, you'll see these long beaks, these black beaks that people often wear as masks, and the black coats. Those were based on the plague doctors. The plague doctors were given uniforms that were meant to protect them from the plague by the cities. Volunteer societies sprang up to tend to the dying and to bury the dead. And so we see that societies can respond in a number of ways. And the very last wave, and there have been many waves since, and the plague has not still left us, but the last big wave, which was one that affected Asia and affected Latin America at the very end of the 19th century, what we saw was an emerging set of regimes in countries, sanitary reform, which was already well underway, people saying, well, we don't quite know how it spread, although they were about to find out, but we will try and get better water, we'll try and clean up the noxious parts of cities, and many of them are very noxious indeed. And you got international cooperation. And of course, this is so important because plagues, like many other catastrophes, are international in scope. And so you got international sanitary conferences. I mean, these are not exciting, perhaps, but they're absolutely crucial to the massive improvements in public health. You began to get regional bureaus dealing with local outbreaks of plague. And of course, this was a globalized world, and so more and more people were traveling. Just as people were traveling to Venice and Genoa in the 14th century, more and more people were traveling in the 19th century. And so disease was spreading more quickly around the world. And we eventually got, in 1920, the League of Nations Health Organization. And after, of course, the Second World War, we got the World Health Organization. And so we can respond. And I think the responses of individual societies and the responses of the international world, the international community, show that we are certainly capable of responding. The dangers always are, of course, we respond too slowly. We are slow to respond and recognize the challenges. In the First World War, for example, the organizers, the leaders, the political leaders, the bureaucrats in many states involved in the war were very slow to recognize the tremendous demands of that war, because their military, they and their military had been planning on a series of short victories, the famous saying, the troops will be home by Christmas. They thought the war would last at most for 3 or 4 months. Somebody would win, somebody would lose, and then they'd sit down and make peace. And they found to their horror, in the very first weeks of the war, in August 1914, they were using up the stockpiles of shells and ammunition of all sorts, which they had thought would last them for the whole war. And they had not, the governments at home had not taken measures to stockpile the necessary material for war, the necessary raw materials for war. They had allowed skilled labor to go off to fight when they would have been much more usefully deployed at home, making the weapons that were needed to fight. And so it took a number of societies quite a while to adjust. And those that adjusted most successfully were the ones that persisted and came out of the war in the best shape. The British were very good at mobilizing their economy and mobilizing their people in both the First and Second World Wars. And I think that really counted for the eventual victory of Britain in both those wars. And I think we've seen the same slowness to come to terms with an emerging crisis in the current pandemic. The Chinese were slow to recognize what was happening in Wuhan and did not immediately tell the rest of the world about it. And that probably enabled it to spread. And I remember being in the UK at the beginning of March last year, and we were all very slow to recognize what was happening. In fact, I think the British public was recognizing it before the government and putting themselves into lockdown. What does seem to me that history shows, and again, the present pandemic is showing, that those societies, and you mentioned this, Claire, with high levels of trust, tend to work better because people trust their leaders, and crucially, leaders trust the people. You know, you have to trust the people to follow your instructions and to understand what it is they're doing. Societies with strong institutions, both social and political, and with good leadership. I think leadership really matters in these moments of crises. And so in the 17th century, while much of the world was suffering from various plagues and various catastrophes, from climate-induced catastrophes to war, Tokugawa Japan survived and even flourished. And that was partly because the rulers avoided getting involved in foreign ventures, which are expensive and destabilizing. They weren't taxing the public very heavily, partly because they weren't very good at taxing, but that meant that the public was able to produce and consume a lot of what it had. And the government really didn't interfere much in society. And so Japan had, partly because of its government and partly because of its social institutions, 2 centuries of peace and far fewer famines than other societies. What I think we've also realized in face of catastrophe is that it's important that there should be fairness. And in the First and Second World Wars, again, those societies which managed rationing fairly and shared the burden, or appeared to be sharing the burden between the rich and the poor, held together better than those societies where it was felt that the rich were not bearing the fair burden. And so in Russia, people simply lost faith in their own government by 1917 because the burden of the war fell disproportionately on those who had no resources to begin with. And the same thing, I think, was true of other countries at the same time. And so importance of fairness, importance of the distribution, both of the hardships of war, but also such things as food and medicines. And we can see what happens when societies don't function well in the face of catastrophe. The Russian Revolution is, I think, a prime example of that. The disintegration of Austria-Hungary is yet another. And what can be very dangerous for the continuing health of societies that emerge out of catastrophe is the search for blame. Someone, something did this. And we've seen the flourishing of conspiracy theories, just as we saw them in the Middle Ages. In the Black Death, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories and attacks on Jews, who were a visible minority, and foreigners. And we saw it again at the end of the First World War, and we saw it again at the end of the Second World War, blaming the arms manufacturers, blaming individuals, and we see it happening today. There's been the most, yet again, the most disgusting attacks in Hungary by the Orban government on George Soros, who has become a figure of hate for peoples around, populists around the world. Orban also blames refugees for spreading the COVID. Modi in India, Prime Minister Modi blames the Muslims. And so not all states work well. And we see in crises the breakdown of national and international cooperation. And we're seeing again that happening today. And we're seeing certain states responding a lot better. And I think it's those states with cohesion and good leadership, and the failures of those states which don't have it. And so I think we have to bear in mind both that we can make mistakes and do make mistakes, but we mustn't get too pessimistic. I think we need to remember that societies can pull together and can pull through crises and sometimes come out stronger, because what they also do, and perhaps we can talk about this a bit, is look at where they went wrong. I think that's very important, that they examine, when they have time to draw a breath, what went wrong.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to draw you out a little bit more on when you talked about international cooperation. That came later in your remarks from when you talked about the city-state. One of the things that's been really interesting as the pandemic goes on is this idea of the new localism. It's not obviously only because of COVID, it links into all kinds of issues to do with sustainability, to do with new community identities. But I'd be interested, with your historical lens, to have some reflections on how you think governance and the future of cross-border collaboration may be looking, bearing in mind that the whole World War II institutional architecture is increasingly subject to critique, not only because not everybody feels that they are at the table.
Yeah. Well, two parts to your question, I think, both of which are very interesting. I think, first of all, we need to understand that probably what works best in dealing with challenges is a mixture of localism and national institutions and international institutions. And I think one of the problems has been, and has been in the past, is when governments, highly centralized governments, try to prescribe everything for the whole of their societies. And often local peoples know best what works in their societies. And this has come out very much in the criticism of the British government, that local governments are saying, look, we know our regions, we can do the track and tracing because we know the communities and we can get cooperation from the communities. If you try and do it all from London, you're not going to get, you don't have the local knowledge we have, and you're not going to get the cooperation that we can have. And so I think you have to, as much as possible, encourage local initiative, but that doesn't mean you mustn't have overarching national or international standards. I mean, very important that localities follow the same protocols. Again, to take the pandemic, which of course is much on our minds at the moment, it's very important that if there's going to be a lockdown, it's in all localities. You can't have a lockdown on one side of the street and not on the other side of the street. We all know that, excuse me, we all know that that is going to cause problems. And so I think you do have to have some sort of attempt to set, with cooperation of localities, national standards. And one of the problems that federal states have had, and I think it's very visible in the United States, also surprisingly in Switzerland, that you have not had strong national leadership. And so you've had people really making it up at the local levels, in some cases doing quite well, but the fact that they're interlocking communities means that they can't prevent the pandemic from spreading. And the United States, we understand, I mean, the federalism of the United States has always been conditional. The states have always felt it to be conditional. And you have very strong identification of elites and also of peoples in different states with that state. And I think it's also been compounded by the failure of the Trump administration to take any leadership role, virtually any leadership role whatsoever. But I was surprised in Switzerland. I was talking to someone there the other day, excuse me, who said, you know, it's really not very good here because the cantons are running things themselves and there is virtually no federal leadership. And so I think it has to be a combination. And the same thing I think is true of international leadership and organization. First of all, you have to hope that the great powers will take a leadership role, because if they don't, it's going to be more difficult for the middle powers and the smaller powers to do anything. And I think you also have to hope that the institutions, which have been built up over time, as you at Salzburg know so well, how long it takes to build up institutions and how important it is. You know, coming out of the Second World War, I think we realize that collectively. Those institutions have to be maintained. I mean, it's like a house. You can't just build it once and say, well, I don't need to repair the roof anymore. I don't need to replace broken windows. You have to keep it built. And I think we have not been doing enough of this. And of course, and I'll perhaps talk about this in my last set of remarks, we've also seen people deliberately undermining order, both domestically and internationally.
If I can just briefly tease out on one aspect, on the supranational. You talked earlier about blind spots. And here we see, I would suggest, a foreseeable risk that the whole issue about vaccine availability, vaccine affordability, collaboration around vaccines runs the foreseeable risk of dividing North and South and pitting richer countries in each hemisphere against each others. What's your sort of take on that, and how do you see that leadership piece playing out at the moment in terms of dealing with that blind spot?
Well, it is a blind spot, and we've seen it already. We saw a dispiriting, to put it mildly, scramble for personal protective equipment and for treatments for the pandemic. And that, I think, was very harmful to relations between the more developed and less developed parts of the world. It has righted itself slightly now. I think there was a recognition that the obvious greed, I think, of certain developed countries to get their hands on what they needed for their own citizens was actually damaging them internationally. And I think that is important. And I think it will be very important that the vaccines do not become something that the rich countries get first. Luckily, I think we have a number of countries that have already pledged to make vaccines and have put up the money to make vaccines available to the countries that will need them. And we've also seen private initiatives. The Gates Foundation is playing a very important part in this. And so I think we have to hope that there will be enough initiative from countries with progressive and outward-looking foreign policies, and from very influential private individuals and foundations, to ensure that the gap in healthcare does not grow any greater than it already is.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the third part, Margaret, and then we're going to open it up to our virtual community. We are asking you to turn futurist now and to think about what the historians and political scientists in 2050 are going to be saying when they look back on this perfect storm of 2020.
Well, they're probably going to be saying, I think, rather what I've been saying about the First World War, or the Black Death, they're going to look back and say, you know, how did they get it so wrong? And why didn't they take better measures? Why did they allow people to keep traveling when we knew that there was a pandemic happening? And why was governments in some cases so slow to get engaged in the issues? And why did you have certain governments which tried to deny there was a problem at all? You know, why did the government of Brazil, or at least the president of Brazil, deny that there was any COVID pandemic? He said it's just a case of sniffles and refused to take serious measures. So I think we'll do what we always do. We look back and say, how could they have been so stupid? And they'll be making mistakes themselves at the same time. I mean, that's one of the things history teaches you, perhaps, is a sort of humility, that we can easily spot the mistakes in the past, but we have to remember that we are making absolutely silly mistakes ourselves. But I think what we may look back at, or if historians of the future may look back at and say, this was a time in which thinking and practice shifted significantly. Now, I may be wrong, but there are, I think, sometimes turning points in human affairs. And we may look back at 2020 and say, you know, something really shifted in this period. People became aware that the free markets couldn't provide everything, that neoliberalism didn't have answers for everything, that in fact you needed government intervention. And the idea that if governments spent too much money to prop up economies, this would somehow lead to further catastrophe, seems to me, at the moment at least, to have gone out the window. Governments have been spending in a way to prop up economies and to help the more vulnerable people in society in ways that seemed unthinkable before the pandemic struck. You know, there was a problem with homeless in Great Britain. Suddenly that problem was solved, at least temporarily, when the pandemic struck, because there were empty hotels and people were put into hotels. And it may well have made a real shift in thinking about how we deal with such problems, how we reinforce the international order to deal with these sorts of challenges. I think maybe something else that we're seriously thinking about, excuse me. Sorry, this is not a pandemic. This is just a dry atmosphere in Toronto. So I think, I think we may see a shift in thinking. And I think there are a number of things that we were sort of aware of before the pandemic hit: growing inequality in many societies, the growing gap between the very rich and the poor, and the squeezing on the middle classes, the lack of opportunity for young people, the sense that young people, if they can get an education, will end up burdened with debt and may not be able to find meaningful jobs, the loss of jobs, which makes it impossible it's hitting, for example, white working class men very hard. All these sorts of issues we were aware of, but I think we're much more aware of them now. And so we may actually, when we come out of this, and who knows, but from 2050, they may look back and say, well, yes, they had a pretty rough time of it, but they did actually reinforce certain things, and they did take a look at their own societies, very much as the welfare state came out of the Second World War in Britain, you know, that it may be a time of renewal. So perhaps let's hope so. But we do have a number of issues, and I think we are looking at them at the moment. You know, things that we are concerned about. I mean, the international order is pretty shaky, and you have powers that don't seem to want to obey by the laws, the international laws and the norms and the practices of that have been built up laboriously over the past. Russia, for example, seizing Crimea. This is something that really violates international law and our understanding that you do not seize territory by aggression, and that the seizure of territory through aggression does not confer sovereignty. Well, it has really conferred sovereignty in the case of Crimea. And we've seen something similar in what is happening with the territories which Israel took at the end of the 67 and 73 wars. The United States has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and that is a serious breach of international law and international norms. And so I think there are things that we need to worry about. And of course, we need to worry about the growing impact of climate change. I mean, the list is long. The mass movements of population that are going to go on and are increasing in number, conflicts over resources, conflicts over food, and of course, the possibility of a conflict between China and the United States. So lots of things to worry about, but I'm hoping that from the future, people may look back and say, look, they did learn something, and they did avert perhaps an even worsening situation. I prefer to be an optimist on these things.
Which should have been my question to you at the very beginning, I'm sure. Your reference to demographics and people movements reminded me of something that I lived through here, where we did some work on developing a special program on climate migration, because, you know, we ain't seen nothing yet. And we were told when we discussed with partners back in 2015, 2 dirty words in your title, the C word and the M word, you'll never raise money. So that issue of blind spots and no-go areas is something that, you know, I think all of us on this call, on this conversation, will encounter in different spaces of our own existence. Now we have the joy of opening up the conversation. And the first person that I'm going to invite to pose this question is Nicholas Palliser, who very fittingly is Sir Michael's son. So Nicholas, if you can activate your video link, we should be able to see you and kick off the conversation.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can hear you, and we, from basement experience, we're going to see you very soon.
Okay.
We're not seeing you quite yet. Have you activated your video button?
I do, I have, yes.
Well, keep talking, and we'll hope that some magic, some fairy dust is sprinkled that will allow us to see you as well.
Well, the visuals aren't important. You briefly touched on it, Margaret, and I was very interested in what you were saying in terms of the plague, and that you know, minorities were blamed, and all sorts of people were blamed to try and explain it. And I was thinking today, these days, about the spread of fake news, and also conspiracy organizations like QAnon, etc., which of course these days have the ability to spread and be, in my opinion, far more dangerous than they probably were in the Middle Ages because of lack of communication reach. And I was wondering how historians will deal with the concept of fake news, and how is there any hope of readdressing the balance that seems to have been upset these days, especially under the Trump administration, when truth seems to be an abstract concept?
Yes, and it's something I think that is deeply concerning to me as an historian, but also as a citizen. You know, that infamous phrase of what I'm trying to forgetting a name, which is a good thing. One of Trump's advisors who said there are alternative facts.
Yeah.
And I think it's just as well I've forgotten her name. Perhaps this says something about what I'm hoping will happen when the Biden administration takes over. But I think it is a real problem. And I think we're only really coming to terms with the internet and the role of the service providers in providing platforms for all sorts of impossibly crazy ideas, conspiracy theories, things that have no connection to evidence. And I think we're beginning to catch up with the challenge that this poses, and also the role of different states in using disinformation as a weapon very consciously. And we're catching up slowly, as we always do, but I see some encouraging signs that the European Union, for example, is now taking very seriously the challenges of this whole new digital world and of disinformation. And we're beginning to get, I think, a body of knowledge about how to counter some of this. Psychologists, for example, and political scientists and others are beginning to work on how do you talk to people who believe in conspiracy theories, because it's going to have to be both at the macro level. We're going to have to, I think, insist that the service providers such as Facebook or Google stop saying that we are just a platform, we don't perform an editorial function. This seems to me completely an untenable position, because in fact they are allowing these sorts of things to spread, and very dangerously so. I mean, there's now a whole anti-vaxxing movement which is spreading very rapidly through the internet with all sorts of fake claims of what happens if you have a vaccination or how COVID doesn't really exist. And so I think we're going to have to see it at a macro level. We're going to have to see international legislation and international action, and also at the level of regional organizations like the European Union. But I think also we're going to have to think how individually, how do we as societies and members of society deal with those who believe in such things? And there is some encouraging evidence that it is possible to argue, not argue in an adversarial way, but to talk to people who hold very difficult, or views that I would find very difficult. Doctors are learning how to talk to patients who are reluctant to have their children vaccinated. So I think this is an enormous challenge, but I see some signs that we're beginning to recognize both the size of the challenge and ways of dealing with it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nicholas. Now we're going to bring in Sohail Malik, who is a theatre producer from Pakistan and a Salzburg Global Fellow. Sohail, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, and I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong. While you're joining us, Sohail, it was Kellyanne Conway, Margaret. Lots of people joining. There was such a vigorous flurry in the chat that everybody was listening very hard. Sohail, do we have you online? If there's a delay in that, then I can bring somebody else in. Oh, we do. Sohail, the screen is yours.
I think his microphone is on still.
Could you unmute, please, Sohail?
Hi there. This is Sohail Malik.
Sohail.
Yes, I had asked a question basically about the future and how it is viewed. Would you mind if I read it myself?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, sorry.
Sohail?
Yeah. The question that I would like to put is as follows. With the increasing pressure on human beings to live virtually and function entirely online, and with the ever-growing role of AI, poised now to exponentially affect every sphere of life while influencing all our decision-making, is the human species not preparing a future for the automaton to be able to survive independently of us? It is becoming more and more obvious that with all manufacturing turning to fully automated robotic processes, that one has set the scene oneself, unwittingly or perhaps quite knowingly, to make the raison d'etre of the majority of human beings quite irrelevant. As history has shown over and over again, we can just never resist the march of technology or innovation for too long, which has an inevitability of its own making.
So is your question whether I agree with you on this? If so, I don't think I do. I don't think history always shows us that technology is inevitable and determines history. Technologies are sometimes invented and not applied. The Greeks invented the steam engine, but never used it. It simply was a toy for them. The Chinese invented printing, but they used it for religious tracts rather than for communications across China. So I think technology is clearly a factor. I wouldn't say it's deterministic. And I think we cannot tell what the future will be. Clearly, artificial intelligence is becoming more important and jobs are being lost to artificial intelligence, but new ones are being created. There's been a tremendous boom, for example, in the service industries. And it may be that we move into a world in which we have more leisure and we use it more productively. It's quite clear now. Anthropologists have been looking at how hunter-gatherers spend their time, and they have a lot more leisure, and they had a lot more leisure time than we do. Do we need to work so hard and for so many hours? So clearly our society will change, but I think to predict a society in which automatons take over and we disappear is impossible for us to do. It may happen, it may not happen, but I don't think we can see it yet.
Okay, but what about this 3D printing process?
Well, it's 3D is a new technology, and it will be used for both good and evil. Like a lot of technologies, people will print guns, which they'll use for bad purposes, but they were also printing masks to be used in hospitals during the pandemic. And so like a lot of things, technology itself is neutral. It's how we use it. So thank you for your question very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sohail. Now I'm going to read out a question from Renee Levinson, who's the Director of Training and Research Support Centre in the UK. And I nearly asked this question too. Whose history are we referring to? If we start with a recognition that power demands not only asserting a view on one's own past, but also denying the history, lived experience and culture of others, as for example, continues today in the understanding of colonialism, slavery, racism, how do we explicitly overcome this deliberate burying of particular experiences of the past?
I think that's where professional historians come in, because our job is to look at the past in the whole and not to look at particular pasts. And I think the picture you paint of a world in which the past is dominated by those in power is simply not what I see. What has happened in the past few years has been a tremendous explosion of history of groups that had not previously been studied. Women, for example, women's history, which began really big taking off in the 1970s, was not considered a subject really before that. The history of those who were illiterate, the history of those who were marginalized in society. These are histories that are being written and are being written constantly around the world. And the increasingly critical histories of colonialism, it seems to me, do not reflect any sort of power relationship. In fact, they are very critical of power. And so I think I would defend my own profession. I think we've broadened out the scope of our interest and continue to broaden it out. And we challenge, and that's our job. We challenge accepted wisdom. We challenge accepted narratives. We no longer would support, I think, a history that shows the West as the model of progress. In fact, if anything, we tend to depict the West as the model of the alternative, of cruelty, of viciousness. We are constantly changing our views of the past, and we're constantly trying to find voices of those that we haven't heard before.
Can I follow up myself on that? Because that issue of whose voices, the relationship of power in history and so on, is obviously very fraught at the moment and very much in the news. And it's a good opportunity for me to mention a collaboration that we're involved with the International Bar Association and the International Centre for Historical Justice and Reconciliation, a new book with case studies that will come out on contested histories in public spaces, principles, processes, best practices. And it's so topical because the case studies are things like the Colston statue and the Colston naming in Bristol, and so many case studies from around the world, including, for example, in Senegal, and sites that are thought of as being places of slave departures. I'd be super interested, and I'm sure I'm not alone, in hearing your own thoughts about the way that contested histories dialogue or debate or acrimony is playing out around the world.
Well, history should always be contested. And I think what has been added to history is not just looking at new areas, but voices from parts of the world which perhaps were not contributing to global history. I mean, there's a whole school of history called subaltern history, which really grew out of the experience and work of historians in India, talking about the experiences of India and the attitudes of India under colonialism. And I think this is very important. And I think contestation is a good thing. I don't think all statues are sacred. I prefer to see them taken on a case-by-case basis. What I had reservations about with the Colston statue, I thought it probably should have come down ages ago, and the Bristol City Council had been talking about it, but not doing much about it. What I wondered about was whether we should encourage particular groups to take the matters into their own hands, and as they did, tear down the statue and throw it into the water. Would it be more, if the government in Bristol hadn't delayed quite so much, perhaps they could have taken it down, put it in a museum, used it as context. What concerns me is about the focus on statues, and I think they can be used, or other monuments to the past, they can be used as teaching opportunities. What concerns me is if they become an end in themselves and we don't actually look at the present and try and deal with inequities in the present. And I think that the city of Bremen, I think it is in Germany, has actually, I think, had an interesting experiment, if you like. They have a huge statue, I think it's of an elephant, which was erected to German victories in the Herero Wars in what is today Namibia. Now, those wars were dreadful before the First World War. And if you want to use the word genocide, the Germans, I think, were doing it. They drove the Herero into the deserts, killed their stock, and many thousands of Herero died. And there was a move to take down this statue. And instead, what they have done is contextualize it. They use it as an educational site. They've put up information. They've also put up a statue to the Herero. More than that, and I think this is the important part, they have tried to build a relationship with Namibia to offer support in, for example, things such as education. And so if this consideration of the past can be used to try and both educate in the present and deal with inequities in the present, I think that's the most productive use of such moments.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Margaret. So now we're going to bring in by video, touch wood that it works, Natasha Chaundy, who is a writer based in the US and a Salzburg Fellow. Natasha, can we work our magic to bring you in? No.
I'm going to come in. I'm sorry, I'm trying to come in. Okay, let me see if I can.
It's working. It's working. Perfect.
Thank you for having me. The question I had for Margaret is, so much of what you said, whether it's about the bubonic plague, the pandemics in the past, the citizenry displacement, so many global issues. I wasn't aware of it myself. And I'm thinking the leaders who are now in a position to make decisions, is there a role for historians to play in bringing them into this dialogue so they understand the past and are able to make responsible decisions? For example, now in the pandemic, I'm here in Florida, and as we can see, as the whole world sees, we are operating, or at least the leadership is operating in a vacuum and without any basis in facts or science or any understanding of what is really happening. Do historians have a role to play in having this dialogue with leaders so they understand where we were, where we are, and where we might be going in the future?
I agree. I think we do have a role to play, and I'm very glad you asked that question. The problem is that both sides have to want to do it. And so you have to have political leaders and other sorts of leaders who are historically minded enough to know that talking about past crises might be helpful to them. And that perhaps is a reflection of our public education, that not all of our leaders have such an understanding. And if you look at past leaders, if you think of people like Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt, they had a very strong understanding of history. And I think it helped to inform them as political leaders and deal with crises in the present. And so that's one side of the problem. I think the other side of the problem is that historians have to want to do it. And I think a number of historians would regard this as somehow going out into the public marketplace, which I think is wrong. I think it's important for us to talk to those in positions of power. And there's been a very interesting development. A number of places, King's College in London, Johns Hopkins in Washington, and Harvard have set up what they call Centers for Applied History, where they try to use case studies from the past as a way of informing the present. And they bring together those who make policy and those who have been engaged in having to administer policy with those historians. And I find these meetings potentially very productive. I think anything that expands your understanding and helps you to formulate questions is good. And so I think the broader your frame of reference, the better, the more chance you have of actually dealing effectively with what you're facing in the present. Thank you for your question.
I have one more question, if I may. Is it?
Yes, what do I tell my, very short.
Yes, what do I tell my kids in terms of how to be vigilant about and how to educate them about what happened and what is to come? How can they be vigilant and what can they do in the current situation and in terms of history and in terms of the present and future?
I think you can teach them resilience, that people in the past have gone through real challenges and often come through them, and that often people in the past have faced things perhaps worse than they are facing. I mean, I know how difficult it is for young people and particularly I think for teenagers, because it's a time of their life when they want to be out and establishing themselves as individual personalities. It's been hard for everyone, but I think particularly perhaps for teenagers. And I think what we can do perhaps with history is say to them, we know this is difficult and it won't last forever. And you may be gaining things from this experience as people in the past gain things from experience. People who come through great crises are often more resilient, have gained from that experience, and perhaps have more empathy towards others, so that this time will not be wasted. I know they feel, and when you're young, a week seems too long, and they must feel that time is wasting. But let's hope that they can come out of this understanding that others have been through similar things, and it's not all a loss.
That was so beautifully put. And thank you, Natasha. They were great questions. And it reminded me of work that we did in 2015 around youth economics and violence, where I learned for the first time the word waithood and that kind of pressure of being a teenager and how do you actually get agency and realization. It actually segues beautifully into our next question from Graham Robb, who is an education series fellow. So Graham, if you can join us to pose your question directly. Graham is a youth justice and education consultant, so fantastic timing. Graham.
Hello, and well, thank you, Margaret. It's been a really interesting afternoon, and greetings from the English Midlands, north of Oxford. So my question is about, in the Second World War, in the midst of the Second World War, there was in the UK the visioning of what a positive future might look like, National Health Service and all the other social innovations you mentioned. Where do you see the points of pivot and hope now in the middle of all these crises that will take us into more positives in the future? Thank you.
I think what was striking about the English government, the British government response rather, in the Second World War, is they actually asked Sir William Beveridge to do a report on a better society. And I think it's a reflection both of the government's thinking and the willingness of society to contemplate and indeed to want a better society at the end of the war, and also the forceful nature of Beveridge himself, who took his brief and probably went beyond what the government wanted, but came up with a whole scheme for the welfare state, and was in fact extremely persuasive and very good at persuading people this was a good idea. So I think what we haven't seen yet are governments doing that. And unless someone knows of a government, I don't know about all the governments in the world, but I think very important that government should take an initiative to learn from what has happened, and to set up commissions or groups or single individuals like Beveridge who will begin to come up with ideas about how things might be better in the future. What can we learn from this, and how can we make it better, and how can we build resilience into our societies? I mean, there are all sorts of ideas floating out there. Where the ideas are at the moment is in think tanks, in magazines, among journalists, among academics, among those who have an interest in such things. So there are lots of ideas being floated around, but what I'm not seeing yet is concerted government action to try and do something about it. And I think that would be very helpful. Even just going through, I mean, official histories were written at the end of the First and Second World Wars, not just to commemorate the victory, but actually to explore where we went wrong and where we didn't. I mean, on all sides, people tried to work out how their war effort had succeeded and where it hadn't. And I think, I mean, since you raised it, I hadn't really thought of this, but I think it'd be really important for governments to begin to say, we're going to learn from this, and we're going to set up commissions, and we're going to try and make things better. I mean, just to take one example, the fragility of international supply lines. You know, we should be thinking about things like that. We should be thinking about ensuring that adequate things that people need for health and safety are produced near at hand or produced in your own country. So I think there should be a lot of reflection. It's beginning to happen, but I haven't seen yet, and perhaps you know, much government action on this or much international action on this.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Graham. Now we're going to bring in Daniel Snowman, who's a senior research fellow. Daniel, are you able to join us in the flesh? If not, while that's happening, we have a couple of questions that I can read out in the meantime. So I'm going to go back to Odila Triebel, who is based in Germany and works for the Germany's Foreign Cultural Relations Agency. And Odila asks you, most of the time warning signs can be recognized only retrospectively. Probably this is inevitable. So isn't the major mistake of the West their ignorance to relate biological and ecological threats to itself?
I think, yes, warning signs are of course much easier for us to spot in retrospect, but they were there. I mean, there were enough warning signs around. You know, epidemiologists have been saying for decades now that we're going to have another big pandemic. You know, that we escaped it with SARS, we escaped it with MERS, we more or less escaped it with Ebola, but we are going to have a big pandemic. And there were environmental reasons for that. Human beings were crowding more and more into areas where previously had natural areas where the risk of transmission from birds or beasts of other sort to humans was the greater. We knew that the wet markets in China were a problem. People have been warning about it. But I suspect, you know, we want life to go on as normal, and we can only worry about so many things at once. And so I think we tend to explain away warning signs, if not simply ignore them. Sorry, now I'm forgetting the second part of your question about the future. Claire, can you remind me?
It was really about the West's difficulty in relating the biology. I think, if I may interpret, Odila, it's also, as you touched on before, it's happening somewhere else in the world. I mean, we're seeing it. Look at cities, coastal cities around the world. There is a kind of displacement happening about what that risk is, because perhaps some catastrophes are associated with other parts of the world. And I'm not trying to talk from a North perspective here, just to speak objectively.
Absolutely. And I think it's the same with war. You know, those people do it, we don't. I mean, I think this assumption, rather like what Europe had before the First World War, that we are the most advanced part of the world. And so we don't do the things and make the mistakes that others have made. What this pandemic, I think, is showing us very clearly, it is the Asian countries often and African countries, because of course they had experience with SARS and with Ebola. that have done a lot better than peoples and governments in the West. And so I hope this will shake our confidence that we always know how to do everything best and others don't. In fact, we have done worse on many measurements during the pandemic.
Completely. And now I think we can bring in Daniel Snowman, a Salzburg Global Fellow, who's got a question that follows on really nicely from this. Daniel, we saw you a second ago, so I'm hoping you haven't vaporized. Otherwise, I'm going to start believing in conspiracy theories.
Well, I do already. I think that the whole electronic world that we're trying to look at the moment is making trouble for us. I would like to ask Margaret a question which arises from so much of what she lectured about earlier, what she's written about, the parallels with earlier history. I was very struck when you were talking about some of the problems, for example, in the 17th century or before other pandemics or before wars, which of course you've written and spoken about a great deal. I'm very struck at the present how, on the one hand, we've been living through a period of tremendous revival of localisms, nationalisms, tribalisms. You mentioned Hungary, you mentioned Modi's India, we could talk about Trump's making America great again and so on. Local pride, precisely when the major problems, the pandemic, climate, Facebook and Google and what is free speech and all the rest of it, so many of these things, migration, are international global problems which we seem to be resisting. Are there parallels in the past where the historical trends of the time seem to go against what was needed when the crises arrived?
Yes, I think there's always a tension, particularly in a globalized world, between that globalized world and locality and region. And some of it, I think, is natural. I mean, I think people need to feel part of communities, and that can be healthy. You can be part of a community. What is unhealthy is that when you only have one identity. And I think what we need is to have and enjoy and inhabit multiple identities. I mean, I am a Canadian, but I'm also a citizen of the city of Toronto, and I'm also, I hope, part of a global world. And we need appropriate institutions for each level. What is worrying, I think, is when people take refuge in the local and the national as a reaction. And I think we were seeing it a bit before the First World War, because the other great age of globalization was the period before 1914. And you were getting nationalist and nativist movements in a number of countries, often, of course, attacking what they felt were the sort of rootless cosmopolitans, which in the case of Europe often meant Jews. And so you did get, I think, the growth of populist parties before the First World War. And this was, I think, very much a reaction to globalization and to a sense that their lives were being run by outside forces. But you're quite right. I mean, we need both. I think we need both to be rooted in a local community and contribute to it, because that will keep that community healthy. But we need to understand that there are global issues. And if they didn't understand, well, they understood them, I think, before 1914, but I think it's even more pressing now, because the world's economy is so interlocked and the movements of people is so great. And viruses do not stop at borders. We know that. You know, these are international issues. Pandemics are international issues. And overriding all of those, overarching all of those, of course, is climate change. Absolutely. Which is truly global, and there's no point in denying it. What we can do is try and find local solutions to some of the problems, and African countries have been adapting actually very well in many cases to climate change. But the whole package of climate change is something we've got to deal with internationally.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Daniel. Now I'm going to read a question because we can't locate. Chandrika Kaul is a reader in modern history at St Andrews and a fellow. And the question is, I was struck by the absence of any mention of the exploitation of the so-called developing world by European powers, i.e. empire. I was wondering what you make of the recent decision by the British government to cut their overseas welfare budget to the poorer parts of the globe, many of which were parts of the British Empire. Shouldn't richer countries do more, not less, in these COVID times? So we're certainly hearing some leitmotifs running through this whole discussion, but specifically to that issue, we talked about mutual responsibility and respective interactions for the future. So very timely, this question.
Well, I agree completely with the questioner. And I think it applies domestically as well as internationally. those who are privileged, and the roots of their privilege may well come from their ancestors in the past exploiting others. But in any case, it seems to me morally and ethically, those who are privileged have an obligation to others. Those who are privileged benefit from living in a stable society. They're able to keep their wealth. And it seems to me that what we're seeing at the moment, or have seen, is an absence in that sense. You know, the increasing share of wealth in many countries, the United States is an obvious one, controlled by the very rich, by a very small number of the very rich, it seems to me is absolutely obscene and will lead, I think, and is leading to social tension. So even from the point of view of the very rich, this is not a good road to be on, because the societies in which they live will become less welcoming and less sustainable and less stable. And I think the same thing is true of the privileged nations in the world. I mean, my own country, Canada, is enormously privileged because there are not many of us sitting on a huge amount of land and a huge amount of natural resources. And I think we do have an obligation to other parts of the world. However we acquired our wealth, and a great deal of it was acquired by taking it from others, and in the case of Canada, the Indigenous, we have an obligation. And it can be put in practical terms, pragmatic terms. A world in which there are huge differences between rich and poor is not going to be a stable world for anyone. But I would prefer to put it, again, I think in moral and ethical terms. And I think the recent decision of the British government is very unhappy and a very sad one indeed, because Britain had been a leader in helping in development and giving aid. And this seems to me a really retrograde step.
Yeah, I think there are many who share that view. And next we're going to bring in Thomas Sturkel. Thomas, I think you're ready to join us now, I believe. Otherwise I can read it out. Do we have Thomas? We do have Thomas. We don't have Thomas. All right, Thomas, please. I'm with you in spirit, but I will read out your question. If the EU is indeed a vehicle and a bulwark for peace, do the populist advocates of a breakup of the EU lack the imagination that there could ever again be anything but peace in Europe? Thomas, feel free to join in now and phrase the question better.
Hi.
I'm sorry, there was a delay.
I'm so sorry. I love technology. Literally the second, Claire, you mentioned my name, my connection dropped. And now it had to reconnect. Yeah. So my question was inspired by the beginning of your presentation, Margaret, where you sort of juxtaposed these images from Italy and Germany in the 1930s with what's happening in the 2020s, and related to Brexit and what we're seeing in Europe, the discussion around breaking up the EU, and so the drivers behind that breakup and the way they deal with the initial idealistic idea of the EU bringing peace after the Second World War and so on. Is it? I see it almost as a lack of imagination on their part to not consider that something like that could ever happen again, or is it a design feature of their approach?
Maybe both, but I think it's a problem we all have, is that as terrible events recede into the past, we forget why we wanted to do something differently. I mean, I think we forget the original impulse behind the European Union. The groundwork was laid by people who wanted to overcome the poisonous nationalisms, which had so nearly destroyed Europe in 2 world wars. And it was always more than an economic project. It was to try and build a different sort of Europe, and I think has been very successful. But as with the United Nations and the Bretton Woods organizations, we tend to forget why we need them as the passage of time goes by. And I think it's a great mistake to assume that we will never do something again. Europeans in 1914 thought they would never fight a major war again. They thought they had had such a century of progress and they were so civilized that it would never happen again. And look what happened. And I think, the trouble with the populists is they are very good at mobilizing resentments, and they're very good at being against things. What I find is perhaps a slightly heartening sign is that when they get into power, they often make a mess of things, because they tend to have only one note. We're going to solve all your problems. It's very simple. And then, of course, they can't do it. And so I'm hoping, and you see this a bit of a backlash against the populist leaders who have not been that successful in carrying out the wild promises they make. But it is worrying. And of course, it's not just people like Orban and the Polish government at the moment inside the European Union who seem to be determined to pull it apart. There are enemies outside like Putin, who have seen it always as an enemy of Russia. And so, no, it does worry me, but I'm hoping, in fact, I think the European Union has proved very resilient through the whole Brexit crisis. In England, or in Britain rather, well, I think England more than anywhere else, the Brexiteers were saying with confidence, the European Union will crumble, it doesn't have any backbone, it won't survive, it's going to fall to pieces. Well, in fact, the EU has shown itself to be more resilient, I think, than many people expected.
Long may it last.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
And now we'll bring in Nick Westcott. Nick is a fellow and he's the director of the Royal African Society. And I'm reliably assured that I feel a bit like when James Bond came down with the Queen during the Olympic opening ceremony. I'm waiting to see people come down. We have you, Nick. Go ahead.
Thank you. Margaret, I was fascinated by what you said. The problem with populists is once they get in, it's very hard to get them out. Yeah. But also, they do have a view of the past, but it tends to be a mythical one. And the problem here is getting leaders educated in the truth. And I agree with you strongly. It's very important to study the failures as much, if not more, than the successes. And there was an infamous development scheme that I studied that failed. And people had understood the wrong lessons. The problem was not trying to grow things where the rain didn't fall. The problem was in the decision-making process, which was political and driven by a political agenda, and therefore it was never going to work. But what failures in the late 20th century should we be studying now to avoid those kind of problems happening again? Thank you.
Well, you probably know a lot more than I do about development. But it seems to me that the World Bank went through a very important reevaluation of what it had been doing and came to the conclusion that if it didn't do it with community involvement and community understanding, it wasn't going to get very far. And I think a lot of the top-down development of the late 20th century, post-1945, was done without consulting people on the ground and without being aware of local conditions. I remember when I was a student doing research in India, there'd been a huge Ford Foundation project to provide tube wells for Indian villages, but they'd failed to take into account that these villages were often deeply divided between people in the upper castes and people in the lower castes, and that you needed 2 wells, not 1, because otherwise those in the lower castes would never get a well. And this was a very simple thing they could have found out. And it seems to me it's those sort of failure to take into account local circumstances and engage locals, that we should be learning from. As we deal now with pandemics, that if you don't engage people and make them understand what it is you're doing, then you run into trouble. And if you want me to look at catastrophic failures in the beginning of the 21st century, well, I would say the invasion and occupation of Iraq is a classic example, but that's another story.
Exactly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. So this has been so intense and such a whirlwind, and I'm going to pass back to Margaret for some reflections, but I'm trying inelegantly to pull a couple of things that have come up in the chat box up. One is from our president, Stephen Salyer, who's asking about how historians can think of their public roles beyond lectures and books to make themselves more widely understood and available. And another question from Anwar Akhtar, another fellow, relates to the stubbornness of unresolved historic conflicts, in this case, India and Pakistan, and how that really blocks the route to wider social progress. So again, you're going to hear some leitmotifs from what was being discussed earlier about how to move societies forward beyond stuff that is stubbornly stuck in the past. So very unfairly, if you want to share some thoughts on both those as you take a few minutes just to give us some wrap-up reflections, Margaret.
Well, I think both questions overlap in a way. I mean, I think historians ought to get out more. I think we ought to Zoom more. We ought to engage more. We ought to be prepared to write in the media more, because I think we do have a public function. And I think if we don't do it, others will. There is a thirst for history. If you go into bookshops, you will see lots of books on history. And those who will misuse history to their own ends, and this is something populists do, they create national histories. They create very powerful national histories. I mean, the Modi government is pushing a version of Indian history where only Hindus are truly indigenous to the Indian subcontinent, Muslims don't belong, or Christians don't belong, or Buddhists don't belong. So I think it is very important that historians engage. And I think there's been a tendency in the academy to turn inwards and to think that this is somehow cheapening history. And I think that's very wrong, because I think we face, I think, a really important issue at the moment, and that is to challenge some of the alternative views of history that are out there. And the other question really, I suppose, is how we, sorry, the second part of the question, remind me the second part of the question.
Well, Anwar's question was really about how can you move societies on, achieve wider societal and economic progress when the kind of underlying festering sores are not being resolved?
Absolutely. Sorry, I find Zooming, I can only hold about one question in my head at a time, but
I sympathize. I don't think it's because of Zoom.
I blame it all on Zoom. It's not my old age. But no, I think how do you move people's on? Well, it is very important, because history often plays such a part in the enmity. And you think of the relations between Palestinians and Israelis. Again, the history has been enormously important in forming those identities and also making it very difficult for people to talk to each other. There are groups, someone mentioned earlier on, the Commission for Historical Reconciliation. I've not got the name entirely correctly. There have been various groups that have tried to examine history and start dialogues between those who have different histories, even if they just make them aware of each other's history. History is often of the same events. There were attempts in Israel, but I think it's probably impossible given the political situation at the moment, but there were attempts to get Palestinian school children and Israeli school children to look at shared histories, such as the foundation of the State of Israel, and look at it from their different points of view and understand each other's versions of that history, because for both peoples, the foundation of Israel is a very important moment. For Israelis, it's the beginning of a new dawn. For Palestinians, it's the Nakba, the catastrophe. And so I think there are a number of groups attempting to use history productively. In Canada, there's an institution I've been involved with called the Mosaic Institute, which starts from the premise, founded by an Armenian Canadian businessman who felt that the version of Armenian history was one that needed to be discussed with Turks, people of Turkish descent. And he felt that history could be used to bring groups together. And so there are, I think, a lot of very interesting grassroots initiatives like this. And I think they're very important, that we need to try and get people at the very least to understand each other's version of the past, but at best to come up with a shared version of the past and to dispel some of the myths that can be so poisonous. So no, I thank you for those questions, because I think history plays a very important part in shaping identity. It plays a very important part in conflict, but can play a part in reconciliation if it's used properly, and if people are prepared to take the time and take the effort, because it is time and effort.
Those were brilliant wrap-up remarks, and again, they resonate so much with what Salzburg Global Seminar is here to do into its next 75 years. There were a couple of key things that really resounded for me. You talked, resilience came up more and more as you went through, whether thinking about the next generation or the whole structure of our societies. But so did issues about more radical reimagination, be that of capitalism, the future of the state, and so on. And I'm personally struck by how often I see the word regeneration coming up in some of the debates at the moment. You also touched on, in effect, shared responsibility, although you didn't use this term. It's not just for the governments, for the international community, it's also the role and the possibility of citizens to join in that knitting a new fabric. And then that role of new lenses, behavioral science, neuroscience, the ways we think more psychologically about how change can actually happen. And finally, you spoke about multiple identities, and I'm sure I'm far from alone on this call of, hundreds of people around the world who proudly are vested in different ways of different identities, different lenses, and so on. To finish with coming back to Salzburg Global, that act of engagement was really there at our roots, and we try to keep it alive today. That ability to embrace the other and make the impossible conversation. And I've seen that somebody, at least one person on this call, was in our work many years ago on divided cities, which is where some critical, important conversations that laid foundations for the Good Friday Agreement took place right here in this beautiful library. And we're very proud now to work with the Nippon Foundation on our Asia Peace Innovators Forum, bringing people from conflict geographies across Asia together and across disciplines disciplines to really reimagine what peace building can look like. So, so much for us to learn personally, and in listening to you, Margaret. Thank you so much for your generosity as ever, your wisdom, your insights, your fun. It's such a delight to be talking with you. Thank you to the 21st Century Trust and the Aga Khan Foundation. And just a final word, for all of you who so generously shared your time with us, it is Giving Tuesday. And if you'd like to, please feel free to go onto our website and see how you can support our work. But with that, please stay healthy, please stay safe. And Margaret, you're a rock star. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.